The high priest stops at the sanctuary door, his hand trembling on the bronze handle. Something is wrong. Through the narrow gap, he can see the altar, and it's empty. No bread from yesterday's evening offering, no beer jars, no trace of the incense that should still be smoldering. In a temple where offerings have been made every single day for 600 years, where the cosmic order itself depends on the gods being fed, someone has failed. Or worse, someone has stolen from the gods. He has perhaps an hour before the dawn ritual must begin, before the statue of a moon must be awakened, fed, clothed, an hour to discover what happened, an hour to fix this before the other priests arrive, an hour before the question that cannot be asked aloud becomes unavoidable. What happens when the gods go hungry? The punishment for stealing temple offerings is death. The punishment for failing to feed the gods, that might be worse for everyone. But to understand why this empty altar represents such catastrophic failure, why the absence of simple bread and beer could threaten the cosmic order itself, we need to go back. We need to understand what offerings meant to ancient Egypt, how they worked, why they mattered so profoundly that their absence could send a high priest into panic in the pre-dawn darkness. The sun is rising over the Nile, perhaps 3,000 years ago, or 4. The exact time matters less than the timeless quality of what we're about to witness. Across Egypt, from the great temples of Thebes to the modest shrines in small villages, people are beginning their morning preparations. Not just the ordinary preparations of washing and dressing, but the sacred duty of presenting offerings to the gods. This is a rhythm as old as Egyptian civilization itself, a daily conversation between the human and divine realms, expressed not in words but in gifts, in carefully chosen objects, in the language of devotion made tangible. We can imagine ourselves standing in the early morning light, watching as a priest approaches the temple doors. The air is still cool from the night, the sun just beginning to warm the stone walls that have absorbed the desert's chill. In his hands he carries a tray, and on that tray are the first offerings of the day. Simple things, perhaps, but each one chosen with care, each one carrying meaning that goes far beyond its material form. The concept of offering in ancient Egypt was fundamental to their entire worldview. The gods had created the world, sustained it through their power, maintained cosmic order against the forces of chaos. But this divine work required sustenance, required acknowledgement, required the active participation of humanity. The offerings weren't bribes exactly, though there was certainly an element of reciprocity, of giving so that you might receive. They were more like maintenance, keeping the relationship between gods and humans healthy, active, mutually beneficial. Let's begin with the most basic, the most essential offering: bread. Every morning, in every temple, fresh bread would be baked specifically for the gods. Not just any bread, but loaves shaped in particular ways, made from the finest flour, prepared with ritual purity. The smell of baking bread would have been one of the first sensations of temple morning, that warm, yeasty aroma, comforting and sacred at once. The bread might be shaped into cones or rounds, stamped with sacred symbols, offered while still warm from the oven. We can picture the baker, perhaps a temple servant who has held this position for years, who learned the sacred recipes from their predecessor, who knows exactly how the dough should feel, how long to let it rise, at what temperature to bake. This isn't just cooking, it's a sacred craft, a form of prayer expressed through grain and water and heat. Along with bread comes beer. The Egyptians loved their beer, drank it daily, considered it essential for life, and what was essential for humans was certainly appropriate for gods. But temple beer was special, brewed from the best barley, sweetened with dates, filtered to perfect clarity. The brewing process itself could be seen as sacred, the transformation of grain into sustaining liquid, the mysterious alchemy of fermentation. The beer would be offered in special vessels, ceramic jars painted with religious scenes, or in precious metal cups for the most important gods. We can imagine the liquid being poured, the soft sound of it flowing, the slight foam forming at the surface. The priest would recite prayers as he offered it, words of gratitude, words of petition, words that had been spoken in the same way for centuries. Water, simple water from the Nile, was another fundamental offering. This might seem strange, offering water to gods who theoretically need nothing, but in Egypt, where life depended absolutely on the river, where the difference between desert and fertile land was measured in inches of elevation, water was never simple. It was life itself, renewal, the primordial ocean from which all creation emerged. The water for offering would be drawn fresh each morning, before sunrise if possible, when the river was most pure, most sacred. It might be poured into libation vessels, allowed to cascade over altars, offered with the understanding that this was no ordinary water, but a connection to the divine chaos from which order emerged, the none, the infinite potential that existed before creation. Incense. Oh, the incense. The temples of Egypt would have been filled with its smoke, its scent. This wasn't just about creating pleasant atmosphere, though that was certainly part of it. Incense was believed to carry prayers to heaven, its smoke rising up to the realm of the gods, its fragrance pleasing to divine senses. The most precious incense was frankincense and myrrh, imported from Punt, that mysterious land to the south, sometimes identified with modern Somalia or Yemen. The burning of incense was a ritual in itself. Special censers would be used, often shaped like the hieroglyph for scent or sweet smell. The priest would place charcoal in the censer, wait for it to glow properly, then add the precious resin. The moment when the incense first touches the hot coal, when the smoke begins to rise in thick, fragrant clouds, this was a moment of transformation. The earthly becoming celestial, the material becoming spiritual. Different incenses for different purposes. Frankincense for purification, for creating sacred space. Myrrh for honoring the dead, for connecting with the underworld. Kaifi, that complex mixture of 16 ingredients, for evening offerings, for encouraging sleep and prophetic dreams. Each scent carrying its own meaning, its own power, its own way of communicating with the divine. Flowers were offered with remarkable abundance, the lotus especially, that sacred flower that closes at night and opens with the sun, symbol of rebirth, of the sun's daily emergence from darkness. Fresh lotus flowers would be brought to the temples each morning, their perfect blooms offered to the gods, their scent mingling with the incense smoke. We can picture an offering table piled high with lotus flowers, blue and white, their delicate petals still wet with dew. The priests would arrange them carefully, creating patterns, making the offering itself a work of art. The flowers wouldn't last long in the heat. By afternoon they'd be wilting, but that was part of the point. The offering was in the freshness, in the perfection of the morning bloom, in the gift of beauty at its peak. Other flowers, too, lilies and roses, whatever was in season, whatever grew in the temple gardens or could be purchased from flower sellers. The goddess Hathor particularly loved flowers. Her temples would have been gardens of color and scent. Offering flowers to Hathor was offering beauty to the goddess of beauty, joy to the mistress of joy, a perfect reciprocity. Meat was offered, though this was more complex. The Egyptians ate meat, enjoyed it, valued it highly, but there were rules, restrictions, sacred considerations around which animals could be offered and when. Beef was the most prestigious offering. An entire ox might be sacrificed on important festivals, its meat distributed in careful portions, some burned for the gods, some given to priests, some shared with worshippers. The slaughter of sacrificial animals was a sacred act, performed with specific rituals, specific prayers. The animal had to be perfect, unblemished, a gift worthy of divine attention. We can imagine the careful examination, the priest running his hands over the animal's hide, checking for any imperfection, ensuring this creature is fit for the gods. The actual moment of sacrifice was, well, it was blood. Let's not romanticize it. The cutting of the throat, the flow of blood caught in basins, this was visceral, powerful, a moment when life force itself was offered to the gods. The Egyptians understood that blood was life, that in giving life, they were giving the most valuable thing they possessed. But not all meat offerings involved fresh slaughter. Dried meats, preserved meats, even representations of meat could serve as offerings. The important thing was the intention, the gesture of giving, the acknowledgement that the gods sustained life and deserved to receive life in return. Fowl were offered too, ducks and geese especially. These might be offered whole or in pieces, roasted or raw, depending on the specific ritual. The preparation of bird offerings was its own specialized craft. The plucking, the cleaning, the arrangement on offering plates, all done with ritual care. Vegetables and fruits, whatever the season provided. In the inundation season, fresh dates and figs. During the growing season, lettuces and onions and cucumbers. At harvest time, melons and grapes and pomegranates. The agricultural abundance of Egypt was shared with the gods who made that abundance possible. We can picture offering tables heaped with produce, arranged in pleasing patterns, colors and shapes creating visual harmony. A pyramid of figs, a row of perfect cucumbers, bunches of grapes still on the vine, all laid out with aesthetic care. The Egyptians understood that beauty itself was an offering, that the gods appreciated not just the substance of gifts, but their presentation. Wine was offered, though less commonly than beer. Wine was more expensive, more prestigious, reserved for special occasions or particularly important gods. The wine might come from delta vineyards, or from desert oases, or even be imported from Palestine or Greece. Red wine or white, sweet or dry, each type appropriate for different rituals, different deities. The pouring of wine was done with ceremony, often from beautifully decorated vessels. We can imagine the liquid flowing, deep red or golden, catching the light, filling cups that might themselves be offerings, precious metal vessels that would remain in the temple, property of the gods. Oil, precious oil, was offered in remarkable quantities. Not cooking oil, though that had its uses, but scented oils, perfumed unguents, preparations that took days to make, that required rare ingredients, that represented significant wealth. These oils might be poured over statues, creating a sheen on divine images, or offered in sealed jars, their contents to be used in temple rituals. The production of sacred oils was a specialized craft. We can imagine the perfumers at work, crushing flowers, extracting essences, blending scents according to ancient recipes. Lily oil, lotus oil, myrrh oil, each with its own significance, its own ritual purpose. The offering of these precious substances was an offering of beauty, of luxury, of the finest products of human craft. Cloth was offered, fine linen especially. Egypt produced some of the finest linen in the ancient world, fabric so fine it was almost transparent, woven from flax grown along the Nile, processed with techniques perfected over millennia. This linen would be offered to clothe divine statues, to drape altars, to serve as wrappings for sacred objects. The weaving of temple linen was sacred work, done by specialized weavers who maintained ritual purity, who sang sacred songs as they worked the looms. The finest pieces might take months to complete, every thread placed with care, every pattern meaningful. To offer such fabric was to offer time, skill, devotion made tangible. Jewelry and precious objects, these too were offered. Not just valuable items, though value certainly mattered, but objects crafted specifically as offerings. Amulets in the shapes of sacred symbols, small statues of gods, elaborate pectorals and collars, rings and bracelets and anklets. These might be placed on divine statues, stored in temple treasuries, or buried in sacred contexts. The crafting of these objects was itself a form of offering. The goldsmith hammering precious metal, the jeweler setting stones, the sculptor carving faience or stone, each was creating something that would serve the gods, that would mediate between human and divine realms. Their skill, their time, their artistic vision, all offered in service of the sacred. Models and representations, these were peculiarly Egyptian offerings. A model boat, a model house, a modeled granary. These could serve as offerings, the representations standing in for the actual thing. This wasn't cheap substitution, it was sophisticated theology. The model contained the essence of what it represented, carried the same spiritual reality, served the same purpose in the divine realm. We can picture the workshops where these models were made, craftspeople carefully creating miniature worlds, tiny boats with every detail perfect, little houses complete with furniture, granaries filled with actual grain at tiny scale. These weren't toys, they were magical objects, representations that were somehow also the thing itself. Food offerings could be depicted rather than presented, especially in tombs. A painted image of a banquet, a carved relief showing tables laden with food, these could magically provide sustenance for the dead or the gods. The ancient Egyptians understood that reality operated on multiple levels, that the image of bread could become actual bread in the spiritual realm. That representation and reality were not as separate as we might think. Shabti figures, those magical servants, were a special category of offering. These small figurines inscribed with spells were meant to work on behalf of the dead in the afterlife, but they were also offered to gods, magical workers who would perform divine tasks, maintain cosmic order, carry out the god's will. The production of shabtis was a major industry. We can imagine the mold makers creating forms for casting faience figures, the painters adding details, the scribes inscribing spells. Each shabti was a complete magical system, a servant waiting to be activated, an offering of labor, of service, of ongoing work on behalf of the divine. Unguents and cosmetics, these were important offerings, especially to goddesses. Kohl for darkening the eyes, red ochre for coloring lips and cheeks, fragrant creams for softening skin. These weren't frivolous, they were sacred substances, tools of transformation, ways of making oneself beautiful for the gods. The goddess Hathor particularly appreciated cosmetics. Her temples would have elaborate beauty rituals, priestesses applying makeup to her statue, anointing her image with precious oils, creating beauty to honor the beautiful one. These rituals weren't about vanity, they were about recognition, about seeing divinity as beautiful, about making beauty itself a form of worship. Musical instruments were sometimes offered, not to be played necessarily, though music was certainly part of temple ritual, but as objects valuable in themselves. A beautiful sistrum, that rattle sacred to Hathor, a finely crafted harp or lyre, drums and tambourines. These instruments weren't just tools for making sound, they were offerings of art, of craftsmanship, of the potential for creating sacred harmony. The making of temple instruments required special skill. We can imagine the craftsperson selecting wood for a harp, choosing the curve, the grain, testing the resonance. The creation of the instrument itself was a meditation, a slow process of bringing forth music from silent material, creating the potential for praise. Weapons were offered too, though this might seem strange. Ceremonial daggers, ornate bows, decorated shields. These weren't meant for actual warfare. They were symbolic, representing the gods' role as protectors, as fighters against chaos, as maintainers of cosmic order. The war god Montu would receive weapons. The pharaoh, as divine warrior, would dedicate his military equipment. The decoration of these ceremonial weapons shows remarkable artistry. Gold inlay, precious stone settings, elaborate engravings. These were weapons that would never see battle, their value entirely symbolic, their purpose entirely spiritual. To offer such objects was to acknowledge divine protection, to honor the god's role in maintaining order against chaos. Statues and stelae, these major offerings required significant resources. A wealthy individual might commission a statue of themselves to be placed in a temple, standing eternally in the presence of the gods, offering perpetual prayer. Or a stela, a carved stone recording their devotion, their achievements, their prayers for divine favor. The creation of these permanent offerings involved teams of craftspeople, quarrying the stone, transporting it, carving it, painting it, installing it in the temple. The process might take months or years, might require the labor of dozens of workers, might represent a substantial portion of someone's wealth. But the result was eternal presence, ongoing offering that would continue long after the donor's death. The daily ritual of offerings followed a careful choreography. The temple would be opened at dawn, the statue of the god awakened with hymns. The night's offerings would be cleared away, the altar cleaned, fresh offerings arranged. Each type of offering had its place, its proper arrangement, its accompanying prayers. We can imagine the head priest moving through this ritual, performed countless times, yet still approached with reverence. The lighting of incense, the pouring of water, the presentation of bread and beer, the offering of meat and vegetables, all done in proper sequence with proper prayers, maintaining the cosmic order through careful observance. The redistribution of offerings was an important economic aspect of temple life. Once offered to the gods, food and goods would be reverted, taken from the divine presence, and distributed to priests, temple workers, sometimes to the wider community. The god had consumed the spiritual essence, the ka, of the offering, but the material substance remained, available for human consumption. This system meant that temples were major economic centers. Enormous quantities of food and goods flowed through them daily. The management of offerings, their collection, their presentation, their redistribution, this required sophisticated organization, careful record-keeping, complex logistics. We can picture the temple storerooms, jars of oil and wine, sacks of grain, dried meats hanging from rafters, bolts of linen carefully stored. All of this material wealth, dedicated to the gods, managed by temple administrators, eventually circulating through the economy, feeding priests and workers, supporting the temple's operations. Personal offerings, those brought by ordinary people, might be more modest but no less meaningful. A simple loaf of bread, a cup of beer, a handful of flowers, a small amulet. These offerings might be left at local shrines, at the gates of great temples, at sacred spots in the landscape. The man struggling to feed his family might still bring a small offering, asking for divine help. The woman hoping for a child might leave a tiny figure at a shrine to Hathor or Taweret. The farmer seeking good harvest might pour a libation to the Nile at the river's edge. These personal offerings, undocumented, unrecorded, were perhaps more numerous than the great temple offerings, representing the constant conversation between ordinary Egyptians and their gods. Letters to the gods were a unique form of offering. Written on papyrus or pottery shards, these letters might request divine intervention, might complain about injustice, might thank the gods for help received. The letter would be left at a temple or shrine, sometimes folded, sometimes sealed, a written prayer that could be read by the divine. Some of these letters have survived, and they're remarkably human. A woman writes to her deceased husband, asking him to intervene from the afterlife on behalf of their children. A man writes to Amun-Ra, complaining about a neighbor's injustice, asking for divine correction. These letters show religion not as distant formal ritual, but as intimate relationship, ongoing conversation, personal connection. Votive offerings, objects given in thanks for answered prayers, were common. A successful recovery from illness might prompt the offering of a small stela describing the illness and thanking the healing god. A safe return from dangerous travel might be acknowledged with a model boat. A successful pregnancy might be commemorated with an offering to Taweret. These votive offerings create a record of personal religion, of individual experiences of the divine. They show us that the gods weren't just cosmic forces to be feared and appeased. They were helpers, healers, protectors, beings who could be called upon in need, who might respond with aid, who deserved gratitude when they helped. The materials of offerings varied with wealth and status. A pharaoh might offer golden statues, herds of cattle, entire vineyards. A wealthy noble might commission elaborate tomb furnishings, donate fields to temple endowments. A skilled craftsperson might offer the products of their craft, finely woven cloth, beautifully crafted pottery. A poor farmer might have only grain from their tiny plot, but that grain, offered sincerely, had value too. The theological understanding was that the gods valued the sincerity more than the material worth. A handful of barley offered from genuine devotion was worth more than a golden statue offered for display. This democratic aspect of Egyptian religion, this understanding that the gods were accessible to all, regardless of wealth or status, was fundamental to how offerings worked. Regional variations in offerings reflected local conditions and preferences. In the Delta, where fish were abundant, fish offerings were more common. In the desert oases, dates and wine predominated. Along the Nile cataracts, offerings might include exotic products from Nubia to the south. Each region brought what it had, what was locally available and valued. Seasonal variations also affected offerings. The inundation season brought specific offerings of gratitude for the flood. Planting time had its appropriate offerings for agricultural success. Harvest brought offerings of first fruits, acknowledging that the crop came from divine blessing. The cycle of offerings mirrored the agricultural cycle, the rhythm of Egyptian life following the rhythm of the land. Festival times saw offerings on a grand scale. The beautiful festival of the valley, when the god Amun crossed from east bank to west bank, visiting the temples of the dead. This involved enormous offerings. The Opet festival, celebrating the flooding of the Nile, featured processions carrying countless offerings. These festival offerings were communal, the whole society participating, acknowledging divine favor, maintaining the relationship between gods and people. The offering ritual at festivals was public theater, meant to be seen, to impress. We can imagine the procession, priests carrying laden offering tables, the crowds watching, the air thick with incense, the sound of sacred music. This public offering reinforced social bonds, demonstrated royal piety, connected everyone to the divine drama being enacted. Animals bred specifically for offering were carefully maintained. Temple herds of cattle, flocks of geese. These animals lived their lives dedicated to eventual offering. They would be well cared for, fed properly, kept healthy, because an offering animal had to be perfect. The management of these temple herds was a significant economic operation, requiring pasture, feed, veterinary care. We can picture the temple herdsman, knowing each animal, caring for them daily, yet understanding their ultimate purpose. This wasn't cruelty in their understanding, it was sacred duty. The animals would fulfill their destiny, would be honored through their sacrifice, would sustain the gods who sustained all life. The preparation of offering materials was itself sacred work. The miller grinding grain for offering bread, the vintner crushing grapes for offering wine, the florist gathering flowers for temple arrangements, all were participating in the offering process. All were intermediaries between the earthly and divine realms. This sanctification of labor, this understanding that ordinary work could be sacred when directed toward divine purposes, meant that many people participated in the offering system, even if they never entered a temple. The farmer growing barley, the shepherd tending sheep, the beekeeper harvesting honey, all might be producing materials that would eventually serve as offerings. The economics of offerings created a complex system of temple land management. Temples owned vast estates, worked by temple dependents, producing the materials needed for daily offerings. These temple estates were among the largest landholdings in Egypt, making temples major economic powers, but this was seen as necessary for maintaining cosmic order, for ensuring the gods remained well-fed and well-disposed. The temple workshops that produced offering goods, bakeries, breweries, workshops for crafting amulets and statues, these employed thousands of workers. A large temple complex was like a city within a city, with its own economy, its own social structure, all oriented around the production and presentation of offerings. The offering formulas inscribed on stelae and tomb walls, these magical texts were themselves offerings of a sort. The words had power. They could activate the scenes they described, make the depicted offerings real in the spiritual realm. A carved image of offering tables, accompanied by the right words, could provide eternal sustenance. These formulas follow standard patterns. An offering which the king gives to Osiris, that he may give invocations offerings of bread and beer, oxen and fowl, alabaster and clothing, and all good and pure things. The repetition of these formulas, generation after generation, created a stable language of offering, a way of communicating with the gods that everyone understood. The theological understanding evolved over Egypt's long history. In earlier periods, offerings might be seen more transactionally. Give to the gods so they will give to you. In later periods, more sophisticated theologies developed, understanding offerings as maintaining ma'at, cosmic order, participating in the ongoing creation and maintenance of the world. The offering wasn't just about feeding the gods, it was about acknowledging relationship, about recognizing interdependence, about playing one's part in the cosmic drama. Humans needed gods for protection, for fertility, for order. But gods, in a sense, needed humans too, needed acknowledgement, needed worship, needed the offerings that demonstrated ongoing relationship. This reciprocity wasn't equal. The gods were obviously more powerful, but it wasn't entirely one-sided either. The daily offerings, faithfully maintained, kept the gods present, kept them engaged with human affairs, created ongoing connection. The cessation of offerings, the abandonment of temples, this was serious, potentially allowing chaos to return, cosmic order to break down. And now, back in the pre-dawn sanctuary, the high priest has made his discovery. He finds the junior priest who is responsible for the evening offerings sleeping in a storage room, wine jar at his side. The young priest wakes in panic, realizes what he's done, and begins to weep. He fell asleep. He forgot. The evening offerings were never made. The high priest should be furious. The punishment should be severe. But instead, he feels only weariness. This young priest, barely more than a boy, made a mistake. A terrible mistake, but a human one. And the cosmic order, despite what everyone believes, has not collapsed. The sun is rising. The Nile still flows. The world continues. Together, they work quickly. Fresh bread from the morning baking, beer still cool from last night's brewing, incense and flowers and all the necessities. They arrange the altar, perform the abbreviated ritual, make it right. By the time the other priests arrive for the dawn service, everything appears normal. The offerings are in place. The god will be awakened properly. The cosmic order will be maintained. The young priest whispers his gratitude. The high priest simply nods. He remembers being young, remembers making his own mistakes, remembers the terror of failure. He says nothing to the others. The secret remains between them, a moment of human compassion within the rigid structure of sacred duty. The morning offering ritual proceeds as it has for 600 years. The bread is presented. The beer is poured. The incense rises in fragrant clouds. The statue of Amun is awakened, washed, clothed, fed. The cosmic order is maintained through careful observance, through proper ritual, through the daily gift of sustenance to the gods. But the high priest knows something now that he didn't know in the pre-dawn panic. The gods are patient. The cosmic order is more resilient than the rigid formulas suggest. A single mistake, a single missed offering, while serious, while never to be taken lightly, is not the end of everything. The relationship between gods and humans, maintained through millennia of offerings, is strong enough to withstand occasional human failure. This doesn't mean offerings don't matter. They matter profoundly. They are the language of relationship, the expression of devotion, the acknowledgement of divine power and human dependence. But they are not mechanical, not a transaction that fails if every detail is imperfect. They are part of a living relationship, and living relationships can survive mistakes, can accommodate human weakness, can continue despite imperfection. The sun rises fully over the Nile. The morning's work is done. The gods have been fed. The cosmic order has been maintained. And the young priest who fell asleep, who forgot his sacred duty, who could have been executed for his failure, he has been given a second chance, a gift of mercy that mirrors the mercy the gods themselves, despite all the fearful theology, seem to extend to humanity again and again. The bread and beer and incense may be ancient history, but the impulse behind them, the desire to give, to connect, to maintain relationship with something greater, this is as contemporary as it is ancient, as alive now as it was when the first Egyptian priest approached the first altar with the first offering, beginning a tradition that would last thousands of years, that speaks to us still through the silent witnesses of archaeological remains. The offering tables are empty now. The temples are ruins. The gods receive nothing. But the act of offering, the gesture of giving, the acknowledgement of relationship, these continue in different forms, under different names, in service of different understandings of the sacred. The human need to offer, to give, to participate in something greater than individual existence, this is eternal, crossing all boundaries of time and culture, connecting us to those ancient Egyptians who understood, who knew that the relationship between human and divine required offerings, required giving, required the conscious dedication of what we value most. And so the tradition continues, transformed but recognizable, ancient yet contemporary, the eternal human practice of offering, of giving, of acknowledging through tangible gifts the intangible realities that make life meaningful, that connect us to the cosmos, that maintain, in whatever way we understand it, the sacred order of existence itself.